You know, there's something about autumn in the northern valleys that makes you think about endings. The birch trees turn this incredible gold color, the air gets that crisp bite to it, and you can almost feel the world preparing to go to sleep. But in the autumn of 1782, when Ilara Brendan stood before the great feast hall of Clan Fenwick, she wasn't thinking about sleep. She was thinking about survival, and her wild eyes, reflecting visions that would ultimately save 38 souls while condemning 300 others to frozen deaths, saw something that nobody else could see. Now, Ilara wasn't some mystical priestess or high-born noble with leisure time to contemplate the cosmos. She was the daughter of a stoneworker, and when her father died and she was just 12 years old, she did something remarkable for that time and place. She learned his trade in secret. Think about that for a moment. A young girl in the 1700s, learning engineering principles, understanding weight distribution, calculating load-bearing capacities. She was developing an engineer's mind, a practical understanding of how things work that would prove more valuable than any warrior's blade or nobleman's gold. Her first vision came during the harvest moon ceremony. Picture this. The entire clan gathered around the sacred fire, the smoke rising into the autumn sky, drums pounding out rhythms that had echoed through these valleys for generations, and suddenly Ilara collapses. Not a gentle swoon, but a full collapse, and she starts speaking for 3 hours straight in languages that nobody recognizes. She's drawing symbols in the ash, and these symbols look like nothing anyone has ever seen. Not the clan runes, not the merchant marks, not the sacred signs the wise women use. Completely alien. Now, the clan had protocols for this sort of thing. Ancient protocols, when someone gets touched by what they called madness. There are 3 tests of sanity. Ilara failed all of them. She kept insisting, with absolute conviction, that walls of white death would fall from angry skies within 1 season's turn. Winter was coming, she said, but not the kind of winter anyone had ever seen. Magnus Fenwick himself performed the ritual humiliation. This is the chief of the entire clan, and he personally took his blade and cut off her copper hair. She'd worn it in the 7 braids of an unmarried woman, and he sheared it all off. Then her weaving loom, this beautiful piece her grandmother had carved, got thrown into the central fire, and 200 voices sang her name backward, literally erasing her from what they called the Song of Generations. In that culture, at that time, this was basically social execution. You're dead to the community. Your name will never be spoken in the traditional way again. Your descendants won't be counted among the clan families. But here's the thing about Ilara. She had something beyond prophecy. She had her father's hidden gold. 20 years of payments for stonework, carefully buried beneath an old oak tree, and she started using that gold to do something absolutely unprecedented. She hired outcasts, drifters, people who had nowhere else to go, and she transformed a network of natural caves into something nobody had ever attempted before. And the calculations she was doing? They're remarkable. She figured out that each person would need 40 cubic feet of air per hour. She calculated that fires would consume oxygen at specific rates, requiring careful ventilation systems. She understood that water would freeze unless stored against body-heated walls. This is practical engineering, folks. This is someone thinking through problems that most people in that era wouldn't even know to ask about. Meanwhile, clan children are throwing mud and stones at her. They're calling her Ilara the Mad. They've made up songs mocking her. But she's mapping underground streams, testing rock stability, carving drainage channels to prevent flooding. She's solving problems that won't even become apparent until people are actually living in these caves. The mockery reached its absolute peak during the Festival of First Snow. The clan's bards performed something they called the Ballad of the Fool's Folly, 13 verses, and the entire feast hall is roaring with laughter. Can you imagine? 13 verses dedicated to humiliating one woman for trying to prepare for disaster. That same night, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. Now, most people didn't notice. They were too busy laughing, too busy drinking, too busy enjoying the festival. But the wise woman Brigid noticed something. The mice had vanished from the grain stores. just gone. The hawks had fled south weeks earlier than normal, and the moss on the northern trees had grown thick as a warrior's shield. Her grandmother had documented these exact signs before something they called the Lesser Freeze of 1691. Nature was screaming warnings, but almost nobody was listening. Except Elara, standing outside her caves, her shorn hair growing back in uneven patches, her hands scarred from stonework, watching the northern sky and absolutely knowing that she was right. That something terrible was coming, that she had maybe weeks, maybe days, to finish preparations that should have taken months, and that when it came, when the white death fell from the sky, everyone who had laughed at her, everyone who had sung her name backward, everyone who had called her mad, would die. The question was, how many would she be able to save? So, winter deepens, and here's where things get really interesting, because nature itself started validating Elara's prophecies in ways that even the most hardened skeptics couldn't ignore. The northern lights, which traditionally danced green across the sky in these beautiful, flowing patterns, turned deep crimson. And they didn't dance. They stayed fixed in a place for 7 consecutive nights, 7 nights of blood-red sky that didn't move. Now, if you'd seen that, you'd be unsettled, right? But it gets weirder. Ice started forming in perfect spirals on standing water. Not random patterns, not the usual crystalline structures you'd expect. Perfect spirals. The eldest members of the clan, the ones who remembered their grandparents' stories, claimed they'd only heard of this in tales of what they called the hungry winters. Winters so severe that people ate bark and leather just to survive. And the animals? The animals were going absolutely insane. Horses refused to leave their stables. You couldn't force them out with whips or food. They'd plant their hooves and scream before they'd cross those threshold stones. Dogs howled at empty air, at nothing visible, for hours on end. But the most ominous sign? The clan's prized ravens. These birds had nested in the feast hall's rafters for 3 centuries, 300 years of continuous habitation. And suddenly, they departed, just flew away, breaking 3 centuries of tradition, of what had become almost sacred continuity. Elara was watching all of this, and she had something most people didn't appreciate. She had an intelligence network. See, for years she'd been providing herbal remedies to the clan's poorest families. Nothing magical, just practical medicine. Willow bark for pain, certain mosses for infections, that sort of thing. And those people remembered her kindness. The washerwomen, the stable boys, the servants who moved through the clan's power structure, invisible and ignored, they brought her information. And the information they brought was terrifying. Magnus was planning to seal her caves after the next full moon. He was going to claim those underground spaces for grain storage, effectively destroying everything she'd built. So, suddenly, what had been careful, methodical preparation became a desperate race against time. She started working 20-hour days, directing her small crew of believers in installing innovations that, frankly, were remarkable for that era. Leather flap valves that would allow air in but keep wind out. Think about the engineering required to design something like that with the materials available in 1782. Pivot-mounted stone slabs that could seal entrances from inside, creating airtight barriers. And most critically, a series of narrow chimney vents disguised as natural rock formations, so they wouldn't be obvious to anyone trying to destroy her work. The 7 families who ultimately joined her weren't random. Each brought essential skills that would prove crucial for survival. The Clearys had maintained the clan's smoking houses for generations. They knew food preservation inside and out, which techniques worked, which failed, how to prevent spoilage in different conditions. The Mitchells were grain farmers, but they possessed something invaluable, the only complete copy of healing texts outside Brigid's personal collection. Medical knowledge that couldn't be replaced. The Brendans, Elara's distant cousins who remembered her father fondly, brought engineering expertise and iron tools. And you have to understand, iron tools weren't something you could just replace. The clan's blacksmith wasn't going to be making new hammers and chisels for outcasts and prophets of doom. What they brought was irreplaceable. But the real turning point came 3 nights before the storm, when Brigid defected. Now, Brigid was 73 years old. She was the wise woman, the healer, someone who commanded respect even from Magnus himself. Her leaving wasn't some quiet departure in the middle of the night. She stood up at the winter solstice gathering, in front of the entire clan, and declared that the old signs have returned. And she didn't just say it vaguely. She listed 12 specific omens that matched records from what they called the Great Freeze. She had documentation, historical records that most people didn't even know existed, and she cross-referenced what was happening in 1782 with events from centuries before. The clan panicked. If Brigid was leaving, if someone that respected, that knowledgeable, was abandoning the feast hall for Elara's caves, what did that mean? Her medical supplies alone would make the difference between survival and slow death in the shelter. Willow bark for fever, poppy extract for pain, and something really fascinating, mold bread for infection. They'd figured out, centuries before modern antibiotics, that certain molds could fight infection. But beyond the medical supplies, Brigid brought psychological authority. When you're trapped underground with limited air and limited space, panic is as deadly as starvation. Having someone who commanded that kind of respect, who could calm fears and enforce rational behavior, was absolutely critical. The final hours before the storm were frantic. Elara made one last public appearance. Picture this. She bursts into the feast hall, covered in frost and dirt, looking half wild, and offers sanctuary to anyone who will follow. Magnus's son, Thorn, this powerful warrior, strikes her down with his fist, breaks her jaw. You can hear the bone crack, but she stands up again, blood pouring from her mouth, teeth broken, and through the pain she prophesies that within 3 days breath itself would become death, and the sky would fall as frozen knives. 38 people followed her that night. They walked out through winds that were already howling, already carrying this scent that multiple survivors later described, the same way, metallic, wrong, something that made horses scream and children wake crying from nightmares they couldn't remember. That smell of something fundamentally unnatural approaching, and Magnus, standing in his feast hall, surrounded by 300 loyal clan members, watching those 38 traitors walk away into the gathering storm, absolutely certain that he'd made the right decision, that the old ways would prevail, that massive oak beams and warrior courage would be enough to survive whatever winter brought. He had no idea what was coming. None of them did. Except Elara, stumbling through the snow toward her caves with a broken jaw and wild eyes, leading 38 people toward the only shelter that would survive what happened next. The storm struck at dawn on the winter solstice with violence that defied comprehension. And I want you to really think about this for a moment, because we're talking about weather conditions that go beyond anything most of us have experienced. Winds reaching speeds that turned individual snowflakes into projectiles capable of piercing leather. Not cutting it, not scratching it, piercing through it. Temperatures plummeting so fast that trees exploded. The sap inside them froze so rapidly that the expansion literally blew the trunks apart. And across the valley, you could hear these explosions like cannon fire, one after another. And there was a sound, survivors described it the same way, like the earth itself was screaming. Inside Elara's shelter, 38 souls huddled in spaces designed for 50. And you know what? That miscalculation, that overbuilding she'd done, probably saved them. The extra supplies, the additional airspace, the margin for error that came from preparing for more people than actually arrived, it all became crucial. They established routines immediately, because Elara understood something fundamental about survival. It's not just about having enough food and water, it's about preserving sanity when darkness presses against your mind. Hourly head counts. Everyone had to be accounted for every single hour, rotating fire duties, so nobody got too cold and nobody had to work until they collapsed. And most crucially, what they called the story circle. Each person shared memories, told stories from their past, kept their minds active and engaged. Because when you're trapped underground with the world ending above you, your own thoughts can become as deadly as the cold. Above ground, Clan Fenwick faced apocalypse without preparation. The feast hall, With its great oak beams that were centuries old and thick as 3 men, those beams snapped like twigs under the weight of ice, just broke. Warriors who ventured outside to secure livestock, trying to be brave, trying to save the animals they froze mid-stride, literally became ice sculptures standing in the snow, and they'd remain that way until spring. Through the ventilation holes, and this is important, Elara had carefully angled these holes to prevent ice blockage. The shelter's inhabitants could hear what was happening above. They witnessed horrors that would haunt their descendants for generations. Mothers freezing to death while shielding infant children with their bodies. Horses driven mad with cold, charging into walls until their skulls shattered because the pain of freezing was worse than the impact. And worst of all, the gradual silence. 300 voices, calling for help, screaming, praying, and then one by one going quiet. The 4th day brought the storm's cruelest moment. Magnus himself found the shelter's entrance. Think about what that means. The chief of the entire clan, the man who had personally humiliated Elara, who had cut her hair and burned her loom, who had erased her from the song of generations, he found her shelter. His fists, already blackened from frostbite, the flesh dead and frozen, pounded against the sealed stone. His voice, which had once been commanding enough to silence 500 warriors in the feast hall, cracked and broke as he pleaded for entry. Elara faced the most terrible decision of her life, and this is where leadership becomes something more than just making plans or giving orders. Open the door, let Magnus in, and the seal could never be properly restored. The cold would pour in, the carefully maintained temperature would plummet, and everyone inside would likely freeze to death. Or listen to your former chief, the man who destroyed your life, die inches away from you, die knowing that you could save him but chose not to. She chose survival. But here's what's remarkable about this moment: she insisted that everyone hear his final words. She made 38 people listen to Magnus die, ensured that his death would be remembered not as justice or revenge, but as tragedy. That's a level of moral complexity that's pretty stunning when you think about it. Inside the shelter, something fascinating happened. Social hierarchies dissolved. All the old rules about who was important, who gave orders, who deserved respect, they stopped mattering. What mattered was competence. Thorne's younger brother Marcus, who had joined the refugees, emerged as a natural leader during the ventilation crisis on day 5. Ice threatened to block all the airflow, and if that happened, everyone would suffocate. Marcus's solution involved using body heat rotation to keep specific vents clear, and it worked. But it required warriors, grown men who'd spent their lives learning to fight and lead, to take orders from a 12-year-old girl who best understood the cave system's layout. New rituals emerged from necessity. Synchronized breathing exercises to combat panic, because when the air feels thin and you're surrounded by stone, your mind can convince you that you're suffocating even when you're not. They created what they called ice songs, transforming the storm's howling into music, finding patterns in the chaos. And they practiced something called memory gifting, where people shared their most precious recollections, believing they might be humanity's last testament, that everything they'd ever known might die with them in these caves. By the 6th night, collective hallucinations started manifesting. And this is where it gets really, psychologically interesting. Multiple people simultaneously saw deceased relatives in the ice-covered walls, not just one person having a vision, but 5, 6, 7 people all seeing the same thing at the same time. They heard voices calling from empty tunnels. They experienced shared dreams of a green summer that felt more real than their frozen present. Bridget had prepared psychoactive herbs, intended for pain relief, and she carefully rationed them to those showing signs of complete breakdown. Because there's a point where the human mind just fractures under pressure, and you need chemical intervention to prevent total psychological collapse. Elara herself fought visions that threatened to convince her the shelter was actually a tomb, that she'd led everyone to their deaths, that they were already dead and just didn't know it yet, but they survived. 38 people, packed into caves designed by a woman everyone had called mad, weathered 7 days of conditions that killed 300 others. 7 days that would become legend, that would change how people thought about preparation and prophecy, and the price of ignoring warnings. And on the 8th morning, The silence that replaced the storm's fury was so sudden, so complete, that many people believed they'd gone deaf. The howling just stopped. After 7 days of unrelenting noise, the absolute silence felt like another kind of death. But it wasn't death. It was the storm passing, and what waited for them outside would be a world transformed beyond recognition. Emerging from that shelter took 3 hours of careful digging through ice that had formed a solid wall 12 feet thick. 12 feet. That's taller than most rooms. They chose young Thomas Mitchell for the first breakthrough because of his small size, and when he finally broke through, when he saw what the world had become, he didn't speak for 2 days. Couldn't speak. The shock was that profound. Where forests had stood, only scattered. Stumps remained. The feast hall existed as a mountain of collapsed timber and ice. But it wasn't just individual buildings or trees. The landscape itself had changed. New hills had formed from snowdrifts. Familiar valleys were filled level with frozen debris. If you'd lived there your entire life, you'd be lost. The geography had been completely rewritten. The 38 survivors faced this destroyed world with what I find to be remarkable pragmatism. Elara's first decision established the pattern for everything that followed. Instead of searching for additional survivors immediately, which is what most people would do, what compassion would demand, she ordered the construction of smoking racks for the frozen livestock scattered across the valley. This cold calculation, preserving meat that would otherwise rot when temperatures rose, ensured survival through spring. But it earned her the title Ice Heart from those who thought her callous. Think about that decision. People you knew, people you grew up with, might be dying somewhere, might be trapped, waiting for rescue, and you're building smoking racks for dead animals. But within 4 days, those smoke signals drew 17 more survivors from hiding places throughout the valley. Children who had sheltered in root cellars, a hunting party that had found cave shelter miles away, and remarkably, heartbreakingly, 2 infants discovered alive beneath their frozen mothers' bodies. Those mothers had used their last moments, their last warmth, to shield their children. The spring gathering, held among ruins where the feast hall once stood, saw Elara transformed from outcast to prophet. Representatives from 3 neighboring clans arrived, having suffered similar, though less complete, devastation. And what they wanted wasn't gold or food or alliance through marriage. They wanted her knowledge. Elara's Shelter Codex, a detailed manual of construction techniques, warning signs, and survival protocols carved into birch bark, became the most valuable trade good in the northern valleys. Within 2 years, every significant settlement had constructed emergency shelters. None matched the sophistication of the original, but they existed. The practice spread through traveling merchants who carried copies of the Codex, and Elara's methods established themselves as far south as the warm river valleys. Those southern people thought the warnings were fantasy, thought northern folks were paranoid, until their own harsh winter arrived 5 years later. Then, suddenly, everyone wanted to know about ventilation systems and food storage calculations. The new settlement that rose from Fenwick's ruins operated on principles that would have horrified the old order. Leadership rotated seasonally based on expertise needed. Elara for construction projects, Brigid for healing and medicine, Marcus for hunting and food gathering, the Mitchell Patriarch for agriculture. Nobody held permanent power, nobody inherited authority. You led when your skills were needed, and you followed when others knew better. Children learned stonework alongside sword work. Both were considered essential. Women participated in councils, not as ornaments or representatives of their husbands, but as full voting members. And most radically, marriage alliances were formed based on complementary skills rather than clan politics. You married someone whose abilities enhanced yours, creating partnerships that made the community stronger rather than just consolidating power. The Feast of Remembrance, held each winter solstice, required every adult to spend 1 night alone in a shelter compartment. Mandatory isolation, experiencing the darkness and cold and silence that fostered appreciation for community. You had to understand what survival cost before you could truly value what you had. Elara lived 40 more years. She trained hundreds in her methods, and she kept refining techniques based on each winter's lessons. Every year brought new insights, new improvements, new understanding. She never stopped learning, never assumed she'd figured everything out. Her death at age 73 came peacefully in the same shelter that had saved the original 38, surrounded by 3 generations who existed only because she had dared to be called fool. The shelter became a pilgrimage site. Clan leaders sent their dreamers there, young people with visions that didn't fit tradition, inventors whose ideas seemed impossible, and always those who heard nature speaking warnings others chose to ignore. It became a place where being different, seeing differently, wasn't cause for humiliation but for education. Above its entrance, carved in stone that would last millennia, stood her only epitaph. She listened when the earth whispered. 9 words that captured everything. Not that she was brilliant, not that she was brave, not that she saved lives, just that she listened. When everyone else heard nothing but wind and superstition, when everyone else was too busy or too certain or too comfortable to pay attention, Ilara listened. And here's what makes this story resonate across centuries. How many warnings do we ignore? How many people do we call mad because they see disasters we don't want to acknowledge? How many Ilaras stand before us right now, pointing at signs we're too comfortable to read, too invested in the present to consider? The storm that struck in 1782 killed 300 people who had every reason to feel safe. They had strong walls and sharp swords and centuries of tradition. They had a chief who commanded respect and warriors who feared nothing. What they didn't have was someone willing to listen when the mice fled and the ravens departed and the ice formed in spirals on standing water. They didn't have someone willing to be called fool if it meant saving lives. Ilara Brendan, daughter of a stoneworker, prophet and engineer, lived to see her methods spread across dozens of settlements. She died knowing that thousands of people were alive because she'd had the courage to be humiliated, to be mocked, to stand alone when everyone else stood together. And her shelter, that impossible project built with outcast labor and hidden gold, still stands in those northern valleys, still draws pilgrims, still reminds us that sometimes the fools see further than the wise. She listened when the earth whispered, and 38 people lived to tell the story.